Welcome back. I think this is our 6th episode on the YouTube channel dealing with basically my recollections, my reminiscences of my past life. On a previous episode, I alluded a little bit to my parents' lives before I was born. But it occurred to me some years ago, my father, who was, as I told you before, at Pearl Harbor on the Japanese invasion day of December the 7th, 1941. Well, 50 years after that event occurred, his military unit, they were called the 72nd Bomber Squad, had a 50th anniversary meeting. I think it was in Ohio, if I remember correctly. The various people who were there were asked to provide memoirs of their experiences during the Second World War. And my father prepared, a document, shall we say, about what had happened to him. And I was thinking it might be kind of interesting to go to that document and hear in his own words what his experiences were in the years leading right up to my birth. I was actually born on March the 21st, 1944, which was over a year before the end of the Second World War. So these memoirs from my father actually would overlap with the beginning of my appearance on the planet. When he wrote these memoirs, for reasons best known to him, he wrote them in the third person. So he's not saying that I did this, but he's saying that he did this. These memoirs, as I said, commemorated the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it occurred to me while I was looking at these yesterday that this is the 80th anniversary coming up this December. So he would have written these memoirs 50 years ago, and 30 years have passed since he wrote them. So understand this is my father talking, not me this time, and I'm reading directly from his memoirs, and as I say, these are in the third person. He titled these memoirs World War II Memoirs of James C. Fetty. His name was the same as mine. I got his first name, but I didn't get his middle name. And this is what he writes. It wasn't the conventional way to begin a lifelong partnership. James, that is Jim Fetty, completed his course in technical aviation and graduated from Benson Polytechnic High School in Portland, Oregon in June 1939. He then became acquainted with Hazel Phillips, also of Portland, and a graduate of Franklin High School. The friendship progressed until September the 27th, 1939, when Jim, to make use of his technical high school training, decided to enlist in the U.S. Air Corps for assignment to Hickam Field, Hawaii. Jim's initial assignment was to Angel Island in San Francisco Bay for a 6-week period of basic training. At this time, the couple was reunited for a brief period and attended the World's Fair in San Francisco. Then they became informally engaged to be married at some undetermined date. Hazel then returned to Portland, and Jim proceeded to Hawaii. After Jim's assignment to the 72nd Bomb Squadron in Hickam Field, the engaged couple maintained a daily routine of letter writing. These letters were grouped in weekly packages and mailed to correspond with the weekly sailings of the Matson Line's passenger ships between Hawaii and San Francisco. This long-distance romance continued for 2 years while the couple longed to be reunited. However, at $21 per month initial salary for Jim and about the same for Hazel, this was not conducive to an expensive ocean journey. And at that time, the Army provided no living allowance for lower-grade enlisted men. After 2 years of letter writing, small promotions and strict savings permitted Hazel to travel to Hawaii aboard the SS Matsonia on October the 1st, 1941. The times were difficult, but Hazel managed to locate a job at the, I think it's pronounced Leahi Hospital in Honolulu, and a furnished room 1 block from Waikiki Beach at the rental price of $40 per month. Jim and Hazel, now happily reunited after 2 frustrating years of separation, began to plan for their marriage. However, before World War II, military personnel below the rank of staff sergeant were not permitted to be married. By this time, Jim had attained a high specialist rating as an air mechanic second class, which produced the same basic pay as a staff sergeant, but did not include the rank. So the Lovebirds conceived a plot to make a trip to the big island of Hawaii, where they could be married without the information being reported in the Honolulu newspaper. A tentative wedding date for sometime in January 1942 was selected. The period after Hazel's arrival in October 1941 gave the betrothed couple the moments of happiness and contentment that they had sought for so long. However, the months of October and November were not without their moments of disillusionment. Periods of military alerts, increased flying schedules, and other duties restricted Jim to Hickam Field much of the time, but the moments together that the two shared in this idyllic setting were truly treasured. The day of infamy. On the night of December the 6th, 1941, Jim was assigned duties as Corporal of the Guard. This duty consisted of the overnight supervision of the sentries who safeguarded the perimeter of the base, the aircraft, and the then highly secret Norden bomb site. The guard shift was relieved at 6 a.m. on December the 7th. Jim then proceeded to the mess hall for breakfast and to his bunk for some well-deserved sleep. As he sat on the edge of his bunk, removing his shoes, he heard explosions from Pearl Harbor, which was adjacent to Hickam Field. From his vantage point on the second floor of the barracks, he had a panoramic view of Pearl Harbor and the attacking Japanese planes. Since it was 7:55 on Sunday morning, most personnel in the barracks were sleeping in. He immediately alerted all personnel of the attack. Anticipating that Hickam Field would be a target, Jim's next thought was to disperse his airplane. It was customary at that time to keep all aircraft neatly in rows next to the hangar line, but this was an ideal target for attacking aircraft. So Jim made a dash for it, for his B-18, and since it was locked and the keys were not immediately available, he kicked out a small window in the door of the plane and unlocked it from inside. After gaining access, he proceeded to start the engine so the plane could be moved to an open field across the runway. This plane became Jim's home for several days as his barracks and all of his possessions were destroyed by enemy bombs. Many B-17 and B-18 aircraft were destroyed that day due to enemy bombs and strafing. Many lives were lost and facilities destroyed. It was about a week before Jim could advise Hazel of his safety. Due to the extensive damage at Hickam Field and the possibility of future attacks, the 72nd Bomb Squadron was moved to Bellows Field at Waimanalo on the windward side of Oahu. This put another chink in the relationship between Jim and Hazel, as there was no public transportation between Honolulu and Bellows Field. Shortly before the Japanese attack, Jim had been promoted to sergeant with a first-class air mechanics rating, giving him the base pay of a technical sergeant, $84 a month. So considering this fact, and also the fact that the war had started, Jim and Hazel decided to get married on Christmas Eve, no matter what the Army thought or did. And so it came to pass the couple was married. On Christmas Day, Hazel returned to work at the hospital, and Jim returned to Bellows Field. They never saw each other again for 30 days. Married life did not provide more togetherness than the single state had. Jim's official unmarried status precluded his living off base, and who knew what evil things would happen if he reported his marriage to the Army. So the newlyweds had to content themselves with infrequent visits whenever work schedules and time permitted. As the months of January and February passed, it became apparent that Jim and Hazel were again destined to be parted. The war in the Pacific was not going well, and it was the Army's desire to evacuate all military dependents from Hawaii. Therefore, it seemed appropriate to report the marriage to the proper authorities. It was a pleasant surprise to find that no objection to the marriage was expressed, probably because married men were then being drafted in the U.S. Immediate arrangements were then made for Hazel's return to the States at government expense. She departed on April the 5th, 1942, aboard the SS Lurline, thus starting another long separation for the couple and an almost daily routine of letter writing. After Jim's squadron participated in the Battle of Midway, it eventually was moved to the New Hebrides Islands to support operations in the Solomon Islands. Jim's duties as an engineer-gunner aboard a B-17 were interrupted for a short period while he was hospitalized in New Zealand with a bout of malaria. At this time, Hazel was employed by the Kaiser Shipyard in Portland as a badge control clerk. Early in 1943, the B-17s in the South Pacific were being replaced by longer-range B-24s, while back in the States, B-17 crews were frantically trained for assignment in Europe. This produced a need for combat-experienced B-17 personnel at many of the bases in the U.S. The 76th Bomb Squadron was selected as one source for these personnel, and most of the unit was moved to the States in April 1943. A year after their last separation, in April 1942, Hazel and Jim were again united. This was the first time that they were able to live a normal life as husband and wife. Although frequent military transfers and lack of living facilities often caused more separations, these were usually a matter of months rather than years as in the past. Fortunately, during the rest of the war, Jim's military assignments were all in the continental U.S. The inconveniences of food and gas rationing and other shortages were of little consequence to this couple, who truly appreciated the privilege of finally just living together. After the war, Jim decided to stay in the service until retirement. Overseas assignments in Japan and Libya again resulted in family separations of 1.5 to 2 years. However, the marriage withstood the test of time, and Jim retired from the Air Force in September 1st, 1969, after 30 years of service. The couple will celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary on Christmas Eve, 1991. And that was 30 years ago.